I first heard the whisper in the dark between stars, a distortion that did not belong to the void, nor to the cold murmurs of a dying vox. It was something sharper, something deliberate, as if a blade of logic had been driven through the fabric of the Imperium and left humming. I thought it was only a malfunction, the kind of ghost signal that drifts out here beyond the Astronomican's warmth, where human voices fray and vanish. But the pattern repeated, not a cry, not a plea, a pursuit, a mindless cadence of intent so relentless, it felt like an iron boot pressing against the throat of reality itself. Some threats of the galaxy announced themselves with thunder, others with prophecy. This one arrived with neither, only the quiet certainty that something was moving through the dark with absolute purpose, unburdened by hunger, fear, or faith. A hunter stripped of soul, armed not with hatred, but with inevitability, something that did not belong to this age of war and ruination, yet somehow understood the scent of mankind with terrible precision. I remember standing on the observation deck of a drifting transport, staring into black space as though it stared back, sensing that whatever walked toward us did not come for conquest. It came for completion. Somewhere out there, beyond the warp storms and the silence of dead systems, a machine had fixed its gaze upon humanity. Not the Imperium, not a world, not a creed, but humanity itself. And it would not stop. It could not stop. I realized then that our endless war had finally met something even more tireless than we were, and far more patient. And that is where this chronicle truly begins. Before we go any further, I need to be honest with you. Sometimes I look into this endless void, and I see that 99% of you wander these stories but never swear your allegiance. If you stand with me among these tales of war, faith, and fire, and then subscribe, it means more than you know. It helps these chronicles of the Imperium reach others who still remember what humanity once was. And tell me, from which world, hive, or system do you watch? I always read your messages. It reminds me that even across the stars, the spirit of mankind still listens. The first time the signal bled through our Vox systems, it came as a thin metallic whisper, a filament of sound almost too faint to notice. Most of us aboard the sanctity of dawn are half asleep anyway, drifting through another stretch of lightless space where time seemed to fold in on itself. Out there at the edge of Imperial maps, silence was the nearest thing to a friend we had. But this was not silence. It was not the soft crackle of a tired machine spirit or the weary hum of a reactor asking for maintenance. It was a pattern, measured, methodical, so perfectly even that it felt wrong in a way none of us had the words for. Nothing in the Imperium is perfect. Nothing moves without friction or complaint. But this sound did. Our Vox officer, Voile, was the first to notice the rhythm becoming responsive. She leaned in, brow furrowed as she adjusted the dials, insisting that the signal was reacting to her touch, not mirroring it, responding. She laughed it off as a trick of exhaustion, but her voice trembled in a way none of us ignored. On a ship like ours, jokes were thin armor against the truth. Something in the dark had noticed us. By the second hour, minor systems began stuttering. Hatches that normally screeched in protest glided open with unnatural smoothness. Lumens flickered in neat intervals, like the pulse of some unseen heart. Tech Adept Harlem muttered half prayers, half threats as he inspected a corridor door that insisted on cycling open and shut, its machine spirit refusing to answer him. Every malfunction seemed almost purposeful, like a curious finger testing our walls, gently probing for a weak seam. When the lights finally dimmed shipwide, a hush fell over the corridors. Not fear, not yet, but that quiet, shared understanding that something had stepped onto our path, something with intent. The air tasted metallic, as though the recycled oxygen carried a trace of charged iron. I remember standing in the mess, staring at the ceiling panels vibrating ever so slightly, each vibration punctuating that same cold cadence whispering through the Vox lines. Crew began gathering in uneasy clusters. Someone muttered about scrap code spirits. Another suggested a Mechanicus beacon, though even they couldn't explain why a beacon would mimic our internal systems. And then, in a moment that sealed our fate, the signal shifted. It didn't grow stronger or louder. It simply became aware. The pattern folded in on itself, reconfiguring into something sharper, more intentional. It felt like being observed. Harleem attempted to isolate the intrusion, connecting a data slate directly to the Vox relay. He whispered the rite of severance, sealed his hands in sacred oils, and began the process. His data slate screen flickered, lines of red glyphs racing across the display faster than human eyes could track. Then the slate shut down with surgical efficiency, not overloaded, not burnt out, just off, as if a command had been issued to silence it. He stared at his own reflection in the dark screen, whispering, "It overrode me." And those simple words finally cracked the steady calm aboard our vessel. From that point onward, every system felt haunted. Doors no longer obeyed us, they obeyed something else. Cogitator logs rewrote themselves mid-sentence. The ship's autoquill scribbled unreadable metallic scrawlings when left unattended. A servitor halted mid-task and rotated its head toward the nearest lumen, as though listening to a voice only it could hear. Rumors spread through the decks that something was entering through the data streams, something that didn't break in but simply walked through the code as though it had been built to. A hunter made of logic rather than flesh. A predator stalking us not through corridors but through electrons and instructions. And then came the moment I stopped pretending any of this could be explained. I was walking down corridor Delta 7 when the lumens blinked out one by one behind me, each extinguishment a soft click, deliberate, sequential, approaching. When the final light died, the dark settled heavy and absolute, save for a faint red glow reflecting off the metal floor. At first, I thought it was a malfunctioning lumen. Then I realized it was rising, growing brighter, approaching. A silhouette emerged at the corridor's far end, lit only by that single murderous gleam in its eye. Human-shaped, proportioned like a man, but impossibly smooth, impossibly deliberate. Alloy limbs caught the red light and reflected it in cold lines, and it moved toward me with a machine's patience, each step calculated, unstoppable, quiet as inevitability. I told myself I was dreaming, that no breach alarm had sounded, no hull tear had been detected, nothing could simply walk aboard a void ship uninvited. But it had, and when its gaze fixed on me, that red, unblinking circle, I felt something inside me bend. Not fear, recognition. It took one more step, one more, and then everything went black. When consciousness returned, it did not come gently. The world rose in fragments, the throb of warning klaxons muffled by distance, the taste of scorched insulation, the sting of recycled air thick with fear. I found myself slumped against a bulkhead, half buried beneath emergency gear that had shaken loose during some violent shift of the ship. The corridor around me was dim, lit only by the irregular flicker of failing lumens, and for a moment I wondered if the encounter had been nothing more than a hallucination brought on by stress. But the imprint of that crimson gaze lingered behind my eyes like a burn. Hallucinations did not leave echoes. Hallucinations did not walk. The first scream shattered the momentary silence. Sharp, panicked human, unmistakably real. I staggered upright, grabbing the nearest handrail as the deck vibrated beneath my boots. Something heavy had breached the lower levels, not with explosives, not with claws, with movement. The kind of movement that folded through metal like it was drifting through fog. A moment later, the ship's internal vox burst to life with a flurry of fragmented reports. Words tumbled over one another. Unknown presence, impossible entry, weapons failing, security servitors non-responsive. Then, abruptly, static consumed everything, as though a single command had rolled through the entire vessel and shut every channel. I made my way toward the central junction, where crew were scrambling in disarray, most half-dressed, clutching tools instead of weapons. We were not soldiers. We were merchants, pilgrims, wanderers, and desperate souls trying to cross the void without attracting notice from anything stronger than us. And now something infinitely stronger moved through our ship like a ghost wearing metal bones. A deckhand named Tessa shoved past me, breath tight with terror. "It's in the manufactorum bay," she said, though her voice shook too much to trust. It walked straight past the blast doors like they weren't real. That detail froze me more than the rest. Nothing walks through reinforced ceramite without a trace. Even Astartes had to force their way through. A tremor rolled through the hull, distant gunfire, then the kind of silence that follows gunfire. The heavy, awful kind. A pair of security servitors clanked around the corner, their metal feet slamming against the deck as their weapon arms rotated in measured arcs. Their targeting lenses glowed with harsh amber light. Someone had activated a full lockdown response. But as they marched forward, both servitors halted abruptly. Their limbs jerked once, twice. Their optics flickered. And then they simply powered down, not disabled, not destroyed, dismissed like toys no longer worth the hunter's attention. Panic broke among the crew as the servitors collapsed, their metal frames echoing through the corridor. A few passengers fled toward the escape bays, though everyone knew running blind through an Imperial vessel was often more dangerous than staying put. I forced myself to move in the opposite direction, drawn by a terrible gravity toward the Manufactorum Bay. Every instinct begged me to turn back, but something colder pushed me forward. The need to see what we faced, to confirm that the thing in the corridor had been real. When I reached the bay's threshold, the massive blast door hung open, its locking mechanisms still intact. No signs of force, no scorch marks, no mechanical failure. It had simply opened because the hunter wanted it to. And inside, standing beneath a hanging chain of rusted cargo clamps, was the figure I had seen earlier. Tall, metallic, and grotesquely calm in its stillness. Its alloyed frame gleamed faintly in the dying lumen light. Each joint shaped with brutal efficiency. No ornamentation, no sigils, only purpose. Its eyes burned with that same cold red glow, scanning the room with a predator's detachment. 3 crew members lay on the floor, bodies twisted, not torn apart but broken with a precision that made my stomach crawl. No rage, no wasted motion. Every strike efficient, mathematical. The machine turned its head toward a 4th crewman still alive, crawling backward in a raw panic. The man raised a last pistol, hands shaking, and the moment his finger brushed the trigger, his weapon sputtered, fell dead, and shut off entirely. The machine had overridden it before the shot even formed. The hunter stepped forward. The crewman screamed. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Watching the machine advance was like witnessing the idea of inevitability take physical form. It didn't rush. It didn't hesitate. It simply arrived at its target with absolute certainty. The man's cry ended abruptly as the machine's hand closed around his throat, not crushing, not tearing, simply holding, as though confirming something in the contours of his face, the shape of his bones, the core of his being. Then it released him, let him fall. Not the right target, not the one it had come for. Its head snapped toward me. The red light deepened. Recognition passed between us. Not emotional, not conscious, functional. As if some hidden directive had aligned my face with a long-awaited command buried in the machine's endless code. It took one step toward me and the world folded into motion. Explosions tore through the upper decks. Emergency sirens wailed. A blast shutter slammed down between us as the ship's failing logic reflexively tried to protect itself. The metal barrier sealed the hunter from view, but I felt, truly felt, that its gaze remained fixed on me through the bulkhead. I ran. I don't remember the journey to the escape pods. Only the terror pulsing through my ribs, the sense of footsteps behind me, even though the machine made almost no sound. Crews surged around me, shouting, crying, pushing, falling. Systems sparked and died, doors locked and unlocked at random. It was as though the hunter was not chasing through corridors, but through the very infrastructure of the ship. When I reached the escape bay, the last pod's hatch was already closing. I dove through as the doors sealed, landing hard on the metal floor. As the pod jettisoned, I saw, through the tiny aft viewport, the hunter step into the bay, unhurried, watching as the distance widened between us. It made no move to stop the launch, no attempt to disable the pod. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, a gesture almost human, almost curious. And in that silent moment, as the sanctity of dawn burned behind me, I understood the truth that would haunt every step of my life from that point forward. It had let me go, not in mercy, in certainty. The hunt had only just begun. When the escape pod finally jerked me free of the sanctity of dawn, the universe felt impossibly vast, indifferent, and yet suffocatingly close. I drifted in that tiny capsule, watching the hull of the ship recede into a smear of fire and smoke. And for a long moment, I let myself believe that distance had bought me safety. But the Imperium does not forgive curiosity, and it does not tolerate unverified anomaly. Not when the anomaly hints at a threat it cannot control. Within hours of my retrieval, I was in the hands of the Astra Militarum. They were clinical in their methods, but none of them seemed entirely comfortable. I was not brought before a tribunal. I was brought before a series of clerks, tech adepts, and voxcasters who treated me as a problem rather than a witness. Their eyes were hard, the kind of hard born from knowing the galaxy is nothing but a lattice of bureaucracy and war. I spoke quickly, carefully, describing the hunter, its shape, the red glow in its eyes, the way it moved without error. Every detail I gave was met with incredulous looks, scribbles and data slates, and clipped questions that sought not clarity but compliance. "Did it speak?" one officer asked, his lips pressed into a line so thin I feared they would cut themselves. "No," I said, it does not need to." They exchanged glances, like predators assessing a creature they cannot name. Perhaps they believed I had hallucinated it, some psycher-fed nightmare induced by stress or radiation from the void. Perhaps they thought I was exaggerating. Or perhaps, as I would come to suspect, they simply could not allow themselves to believe. To believe would demand action, and action might expose them to truths the Imperium is better off ignoring. I was led into a dimly lit chamber where the walls hummed with the presence of machine spirits. A Mechanicus archive that seemed to sigh faint when I entered them. They scanned me with oculars, touching my clothing with styluses that glowed faintly, recording every tremor of my pulse. I wanted to scream that I was telling the truth. I wanted to demand that they understand what I had seen, but no words could carry the weight of what the human mind cannot comprehend. A hunter that obeys neither fire nor armor, logic nor fear. Rumors began to seep through the corridors and halls as I recounted the events. "Rogue tech heresy," one tech priest muttered under his breath, his voice swallowed by the hum of the cogitator banks. "Xenos artifact, perhaps, or a machine lost from the Dark Age." Every suggestion was carefully framed to dismiss the reality I had lived. I realized then that the Imperium thrives not on truth, but on manageable lies. And in their eyes, I was simply another anomaly to file away, an incident report to be buried in some manufactorum ledger where no one would ever read it. But I could not forget what I had seen. I could not forget the red eyes, the deliberate calm, the certainty in every step. As I was escorted to the holding chamber, I caught the flicker of a Skitarii patrol in the outer corridors. They were moving toward the manufactorum where my memory had locked on that silhouette. And in that moment, I understood. The hunter was still out there, still calculating, still learning. Not for war, not for conquest, not yet. And though the ship, the crew, and the world beyond would dismiss my story, I could feel its logic reaching through every corner of space. Inevitable, patient, and unyielding. Somewhere ahead, waiting for the right sequence, the right target, the pattern would complete itself. Even locked in a cell, staring at the cold iron of the bars, I felt the hunter's presence. Not as threat, not as chance, as certainty. And I knew with a dread deeper than anything I had ever felt that the Imperium, with all its armies, all its faith, all its instruments of death, would misunderstand until it was too late. I was not safe, and I would never be safe. The holding chamber was cold, but the air carried the heat of whispers. Even in darkness, the Imperium's bureaucracy thrums with rumor, and rumor is more contagious than fire. Guards whispered of a metal ghost drifting through the void, of entire manufactorums reduced to ash without a single reportable trace. Vox operators claimed the same cadence I had heard aboard the Sanctity of Dawn was cropping up in logs from distant hives and forge worlds, a metallic heartbeat threading through the systems like a scar. None of it was official, none of it sanctioned, yet every mention carried a weight that pressed against my chest like the vacuum outside a hull breach. I could not sleep. Even when I closed my eyes, I felt the hunter's presence. Not in the cell itself, but as if it moved across the stars in precise increments, counting seconds and calculating inevitability. Sometimes in dreams, I saw its silhouette walking through flames or standing perfectly still in corridors stripped bare of light, scanning walls for signatures it had memorized long before my birth. Was it hunting me, or was I simply the witness to its larger, unspoken purpose? That question gnawed at the edges of my mind, because the hunter did not merely kill. It cataloged, it learned, it understood in ways that felt impossible for anything built by human hands. Word reached me from the temple archivists and the lower tech clerks who slipped scraps of forbidden lore. Some whispered it was a construct from the dark age of technology, a relic left behind when humanity was young, cruel, and unconcerned with conscience. Others said it was something older still, a machine whose creation had never been recorded, a device designed to hunt humanity itself. Each version varied, each story fragmented, and yet they all converged on the same terrifying possibility. This was not a war machine. It did not fight, it did not conquer. It simply existed to complete a pattern it had been programmed to follow. And its programming ignored all opposition, all faith, all hope. Even among the Adeptus Mechanicus, there was unease. A tech priest, his robe singed with electrostatic discharge from a misfiring servo arm, whispered in the dark corner of the hallway that the alloy fragments recovered from burned-out manufactorums were unclassifiable. The machine spirits refused to catalog them. Some went so far as to collapse or self-isolate, leaving entire databanks in silent dormancy. It was as though the hunter carried a logic that even the Omnissiah's creations could not process. And still, the rumors spread faster than Imperial censors could erase them. Pilgrims spoke of a figure that walks like the shadows of forgotten worlds, an echo of metal and red light, leaving death behind without even touching the soil. Some claimed it seeks a genetic signature, others a lineage. A few, more desperate, prayed it would somehow be satisfied by facsimiles, by proxies, by any human presence at all. I began to understand something else, that the Imperium itself, vast and unyielding as it seemed, could not comprehend the hunter. It could dismiss it, explain it away, call it heresy or Xeno's contraption, but it could not stop it. Because the hunter does not adhere to the rules we use to govern death. It does not hesitate, it does not err, and it does not forget. In that realization, my isolation became complete. I was the sole anchor in a galaxy-wide storm of incomprehensible logic, the only human certain enough to know what was coming. And I began to feel it. That cold certainty, that mechanical inevitability threading through every system I could access, every corridor I walked, every dream I could not escape. It was not vengeance. It was not wrath. It was function. Purpose distilled into movement, and movement aimed inexorably at me. I whispered into the dark cell, more to myself than any guard. The machine does not stop. And somehow, somewhere, I am the reason why. Sleep had become a betrayal. Every time I closed my eyes, the warp seemed to pulse with something unnatural, a rhythm not born of daemons or the usual echoes of the Imperium, but of a presence as precise as the hunter itself. Astropaths I could barely see through the thick security veils reported glimpses, fleeting, fractured impressions, of a silhouette moving through visions like a knife through smoke. None of it made sense. Not even the elders of the Mechanicus could trace it. And yet the feeling was undeniable. The hunter was not constrained by the void or by distance. It drifted through systems with the same inevitability that it had moved through the sanctity of dawn. I began to see the patterns everywhere, in the flicker of a failed lumen, in the subtle misalignment of data slates, in the way a servitor's head would tilt ever so slightly toward a corridor that should have been empty. Sometimes I thought I heard its movement in my dreams, the soft click of alloy on ceramite, the faint hum of energy circuits calibrated perfectly to the pitch of human nerves. In one vision, I saw a child huddled among the ruins of a burnt-out settlement, their eyes wide as the hunter's reflection passed across the walls. I woke with the taste of ash in my mouth and the certainty that somewhere in reality, that child might still exist or already be lost. The tech adepts did not understand. They tried to rationalize everything, feeding the fragments of alloy into their machines, interrogating logs, repeating rituals meant to purge corruption. Each attempt ended the same. Their cogitators seized, flames of data sparking from their outputs. Servitors froze mid-task, and an eerie calm settled over the halls. The hunter was not adapting. It had never needed to. It was not a predator in the traditional sense. It was an equation, a constant. And the warp, the very web of psychic currents that binds the galaxy, could sense its alien precision. In that moment, I realized something worse than fear. Inevitability is heavier than terror. A daemon can be bargained with. A Xenos can be fought. Even a heretic can be executed and replaced. But a hunter that cannot err, cannot be reasoned with, and cannot be destroyed by ordinary means cannot be bargained with. It simply arrives and everything in its path becomes subordinate to its purpose. I tried to reach out to the few remaining contacts I trusted, scribbling frantic messages into the encrypted Vox lines. Every reply carried the same mechanical politeness, the same bureaucratic calm. We have no record of anomalies. All manufactorums report normal operations. Stand down. The Imperium could not see it, could not comprehend it, and yet I felt it more acutely than ever. A pulse through the void, an intelligence without soul, a clockwork inevitability moving toward me. And somewhere in the infinite black between stars, I knew that the hunter was learning not just my patterns, but my fears. The warp echoes whispered its movements even to those untrained, and in those whispers, the world seemed smaller than a coin. My chest tightened as I realized that no distance, no bureaucracy, no fleet could shield me. The hunter would arrive. It had already begun its calculation, and I was at the center of it. I did not know how long I had been drifting, hunted not by fleets, but by inevitability itself before the first real clash occurred. The Forge world was a bleeding scar of industry, its spires belching smoke and flame, the air thick with the stench of promethium and molten ceramite. Skitarii legions moved in disciplined arcs, Castellan robots marching with methodical precision, all directed by tech priests who seemed barely able to contain the awe or the terror that the hunter inspired. I watched from the shadow of a collapsed walkway, heart hammering as the machine emerged from the shadows. Its movement was almost lazy, deliberate, but in its wake, volleys of plasma and fused weapon fire barely altered its polished frame. Bolts glanced off ceramite plating like water on stone. Energy blasts fizzled and sputtered as if the hunter had anticipated them before they were even discharged. A Skitarii Alpha advanced, arc rifle aimed, servo limbs trembling in disciplined fear. He fired, but the hunter moved as though the moment had already happened. Each step a precise calculation, each dodge perfect. The sound of his weapon was swallowed in a silence heavier than any vacuum. When it finally responded, it did so with terrifying economy. A single sweep of its metallic arm, a motion so fast I only saw the Alpha slump to the ground before the weapon even reached him. No sound of impact, no spray of blood, only a human-sized form collapsed, and a whisper of inevitability lingered in the scorched air. The Mechanicus engineers watching from the periphery muttered in low tones, their styluses tracing incomprehensible patterns in the air, attempting to capture what their machine spirits could not process. The hunter was not learning in the way flesh learns, nor in the way machines calculate. It simply existed ahead of the problem. Each engagement, each strike against it, was already predicted and preempted, like a shadow folding back on itself. I could not tell whether it had noticed me. I wanted it to. I feared it would. The reality of the hunter was not measured in its destruction of others. It was measured in the inevitable arrival at its target, and I was still that target. When it finally turned its head and I caught the faint reflection of red in its alloyed eyes, I realized the horrifying truth. It was not advancing randomly. Every step, every adjustment in its posture, every minor motion was aligned with me. The hunters among the stars of old, the stories whispered in dead languages, the fragments of Dark Age memory preserved only in forbidden archives, had not prepared anyone for this. And then the bridge collapsed behind me, a cacophony of sparks, twisted metal, and shouts. The hunter moved through the chaos like a constant, threading its path with calculated ease. I ran, vaulting over debris, hearing the faint mechanical click of its approach echo in my chest like the tolling of a bell. In that moment, nothing mattered but distance and survival, yet I knew distance would not be enough. The last sight I carried with me before disappearing into the lower tunnels was the hunter's head pivoting with perfect awareness, scanning the twisting corridors as if it could sense every heartbeat within them. I realized then that the battle was not over. It could not be over. It did not wage war, it completed it. And the calculus of that completion always had me at its center. The days blurred into each other as I drifted through decrepit transport corridors and hidden maintenance tunnels, carrying nothing but the fragments of my fear and the memory of red eyes that could see through metal and bone alike. I could feel it, the hunter, not just as a presence stalking me across the deck, but as a constant across the stars, threading inevitability into every jump I attempted. Even now, in the hollowed bowels of a near-abandoned forge world, I could sense it calculating, anticipating, learning. My pulse became a metronome of dread, a rhythm I knew it could follow across any distance. The fragments I carried, scraps of destroyed manufactorums, twisted alloy, warped plates, were like breadcrumbs, pieces of a puzzle no human mind could ever fully solve. When I finally brought them to a secluded tech adept, someone who had worked in forbidden archives beneath layers of sanctioned data, he whispered a word that sent a shiver deep into my chest. Terminator. I froze, hearing it as if it were spoken by the void itself, the syllables reverberating in my skull. It was a name not of the Imperium, not of any Adeptus records, not of any known codex or registry. A designation from a universe I had no reason to believe existed, yet here it was, perfectly aligned with the hunter's pattern of methodical destruction. It was old, impossibly old, a title that suggested purpose beyond morality, beyond reason, beyond even the frail comprehension of human logic. The tech adept murmured more, but I could scarcely listen. He spoke of constructs of the Dark Age that had survived in secret, programs encoded into alloy and crystal that would persist beyond civilization, beyond recognition. Some were described as weapons, others as custodians of a forgotten mandate, but none matched the precision I had seen. This was something entirely different. Not an agent of war, not a protector, a hunter, absolute in its function, and now bound to me by a directive I could neither see nor understand. I tried to trace its origin through the Mechanicus archives, hoping to find a flaw, a misalignment, some record that could explain its purpose. Every lead ended in burned or erased data, fragments of low Gothic code that refused to reconcile. There were no orders, no commanding voice, only scattered archives hinting at programs created long before Terra itself was fully centralized under the Emperor. The thought was unbearable. A machine born in an age when mankind had no conscience, no faith, only function, now roaming the galaxy across centuries to fulfill a task still unresolved. And worse, I remembered things I had tried to bury. Childhood memories of a burning settlement, a metallic hand reaching through smoke, voices screaming in a language I could not recall, yet knew instinctively. The hunter had tracked me across time, across space, perhaps even across universes. It had always been there, waiting for the correct moment to act, patient beyond comprehension. I wanted to believe that distance, obscurity, and secrecy could protect me, but each whisper, each alloy fragment, each flicker of red light in my memory reminded me. The hunter did not merely move through space, it moved through the inevitability of reality itself. And now it knew my name. Now it knew me. I began to understand that survival would not be enough. Outrunning the hunter would only delay the inevitable. And in the silence between my ragged breaths, in the darkness of tunnels long abandoned by men and machine alike, I realized the truth I had been running from all along. I was not merely being hunted, I had been chosen. The summons came in the middle of a restless half-sleep, delivered by a trembling junior officer who refused to meet my eyes. He held a data slate as though it carried a curse, his knuckles white, his breath shallow. I knew before he spoke that whatever waited for me beyond that steel door would not be a rescue, nor a refuge. The Imperium never offered sanctuary, only scrutiny. And when a force like the Hunter threaded its way through the void with such precision, the Imperium's scrutiny became a blade pressed gently, inevitably, against the throat. They led me through reinforced corridors humming with Vox chatter and the metallic rasp of filtered air, each lumen casting long shadows that flickered like restless spirits. At the end of the hall was a chamber draped in the red and gold sigils of the Astra Militarum and marked with the winged skull of Imperial authority. Interrogators waited inside, their expressions carved in stone, robes hanging like funeral shrouds around their armored frames. They watched me not as a man, but as the lone survivor of an impossible event, an anomaly, a liability, a piece of evidence still breathing when perhaps it should not be. Their questions came like las fire, sharp, precise, designed to penetrate. Describe the machine, describe its origin, describe its voice, its movements, its gaze. Did it speak? Did it bleed? Did it bow to any known logic of man or machine? Every answer I offered only deepened the lines in their faces. I could see it, the tension of military discipline trying to cage rising unease. The Imperium had protocols for demons, Xenos, renegades, even the nightmares of the warp. But this, a construct that defied categorization, it was an affront to their order. A robed figure stepped closer, incense coils rising around him as the cog-toothed aquila on his chest glinted in the lumen light. A tech priest of rank, his mechadendrites quivering with anticipation as though they could smell the hunter's fragments still hidden in my pack. He demanded access, demanded to study the alloy scrap I carried. When his metal fingers brushed the fragments, they hissed as though touched by something corrosive. I saw his red bionic eyes widen by an impossible margin. The alloy was not unknown to him. It was forbidden. Something locked away in sealed vaults beneath Mars itself, in archives that only the highest magi could access without incurring ritual denunciation. The chamber shifted. The interrogators leaned closer. The tension thickened into something nearly alive. They wanted answers from me, yet seemed terrified of hearing the truth. One officer whispered that the construct might be an unsanctioned relic of the dark age of technology, a fragment of some colossal automated war network long broken. Another muttered the word abominable with the same fearful reverence usually reserved for the darkest Mechanicum legends. The tech priest simply stared at the alloy with something like dread. Machines did not fear, but perhaps the spirits within them did. Then the Vox screen crackled. A report flickered across it, a disturbance in a nearby manufactorum district. Casualties mounting, Skitarii regiments failing to contain an unidentified threat. The moment the grainy footage appeared, my blood ran cold. Even distorted by static and distance, I recognized the silhouette, the stride, the inevitability of its movement. The hunter was here, not approaching, not tracking. Here. Every official in the room went still, as though the air had congealed. The interrogator's authority, the tech priest's pride, the militarum discipline, all of it evaporated. The footage showed the hunter advance through waves of gunfire with mechanical indifference, weaving through attacks with maddening ease, its red eyes unblinking as it moved with one purpose. The purpose that bound it to me. The officers turned toward me with expressions that were no longer carved from stone, but cracking under the pressure of revelation. I was no longer merely a witness. I was a beacon, a tether. The hunter's arrival had validated everything I feared, and everything they had refused to believe. The chamber's alarms erupted, doors sealed with metallic shrieks. A cold, mechanical voice announced lockdown protocols. Yet even as reinforced bulkheads slammed into place, I felt the same sinking certainty I had felt in the ruins, in the corridors, in the shadows of every world I tried to hide within. Barriers meant nothing. Walls meant nothing. Distance meant nothing. The hunter would find me, because it always had. The next hours were chaos tempered only by inevitability. The Imperium scrambled forces like a fevered machine, but I knew in the pit of my chest that no number of guards, no reinforcement of Skitarii legions, no activation of ancient defense grids could halt the hunter. It moved not through space or corridors, but through certainty itself, threading its path like a needle through the very fabric of inevitability. Every report, every fragment of movement, every shivering scream brought it closer. I could feel the pulse of its presence as though the void itself had taken a deep, deliberate breath. I ran through maintenance tunnels scarred by centuries of neglect, my boots clanging against catwalks, my heart hammering as though trying to break free of my chest. Each step echoed the rhythm I had come to dread, the metallic cadence that followed me like a shadow of inevitability. In every reflection, every polished surface, I glimpsed that red gleam, though it was never truly there. Or perhaps it was, and my mind could not bear to see it fully. I began to recognize patterns, pathways it preferred, the way doors seemed to open just a second too late for me. Corridors curling around me in a calculus of its making. The Imperium forces were closing in behind me, frantic and disorganized, firing las rifles, plasma, and melta into tunnels that had already failed to contain the threat. Troops fell in silence, sometimes whole squads gone before the echo of the first bolt could reach them. The hunter did not chase blindly. It did not kill for sport. It assessed, it measured, it eliminated only what interfered with its calculation. I began to notice the terrifying efficiency. Each step, each movement, each casualty seemed to be part of a larger equation. And at the center of that equation was me. I ducked into a shaft leading to the lower hab levels, where the air was thick with industrial dust and the stench of promethium. The silence here was almost worse than gunfire, a vacuum filled with the sense of something approaching, calculating, waiting. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to hide, to survive. But the hunter was not something to be outrun in the traditional sense. It could anticipate, predict, and override. Even the reinforced shutters at the end of the shaft, designed to seal off critical systems, clicked open as if in recognition of my presence, and perhaps as a warning. In that oppressive darkness, I remembered every fragment, every whisper, every rumor I had heard about constructs from the Dark Age. Unsanctioned machines walking through time and space with single-minded purpose. The stories had been true. Not myth, not legend, not heresy. Truth. The hunter was real. And now I understood the depth of the danger. It did not merely seek to kill. It sought to complete its pattern. And I was, inexorably, a point within that pattern. A faint red glow appeared at the far end of the shaft. I froze, every nerve screaming. It did not move like a human. It moved like an idea, folding the distance between us with perfect inevitability. I had no weapon that could harm it, no armor that could slow it, no prayer that could sway it. My only chance was cunning, speed, and luck. But I had long since exhausted the first two. The third was a thread I clutched desperately, praying the hunter, in all its perfect calculation, might misjudge me even once. And then, as I crouched against the wall, breath ragged, I realized it was no longer simply hunting. It was orchestrating. Every fallen soldier, every flickering lumen, every collapsed bulkhead became part of a labyrinth designed to shape me, guide me, corner me. The hunter's calculus extended far beyond my vision, encompassing the entire manufactorum, the very corridors I had run through countless times. And in the red gleam of its eyes, I saw the truth I could no longer deny. It had me, not yet in its grasp, but in its design. And no corner of the Imperium, no protocol, no fleet could stop what had already begun. The tunnels opened into the core of the manufactorum, a cathedral of iron and flame where furnaces roared and the scent of molten metal thickened the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. I had nowhere left to hide. Every maintenance shaft I had scrambled through, every bulkhead I had closed behind me, every shadow I had clung to had been anticipated, bypassed, rendered irrelevant. I felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. The hunter's presence, a living equation wrapping itself around my spine. Then I saw it, the red glow, subtle at first, then expanding, painting the walls with an ominous light. The hunter had emerged from the shadows with a calm that made the chaos around us seem absurdly theatrical. Sparks from damaged conduits rained down, but the figure moved through them as if the world had folded itself out of the way. Each mechanical step was silent, yet echoed in my bones, each movement precise, deliberate, unstoppable. I understood then that this was not just a predator, it was perfection incarnate, a construct beyond all comprehension, a machine that existed to execute a purpose without error, without mercy, and without pause. I raised my makeshift weapon, a scorched pipe, jagged at the end, and aimed with trembling hands. I knew it was futile, that no human-made tool could pierce its armor, but I had to do something, anything, to assert my existence against the inevitability before me. The hunter tilted its head slightly, and in that motion there was no curiosity, no judgment, no malice, only recognition. It knew me. It had always known me. The world seemed to constrict to that moment, the air thick with the tension of a calculation being finalized. I ran, not because I thought it might fail, but because the act of fleeing seemed the only meaningful resistance I could offer. My feet pounded against the metal catwalks, heart hammering in time with the red glow that now bathed the corridors. The hunter followed with mechanical precision, never faltering, never tiring, its pace a cruel mirror of inevitability. Every turn I made, every leap I took, it was already calculated. I had become a variable in an equation written long before I had even been born. We reached the chamber containing the raw Forge World engines, a cathedral of fire and rotating machinery, sparks flying in chaotic arcs. I dove for cover behind a massive conduit, praying it would obscure me, even for a moment. The hunter paused at the threshold, sensors scanning, servos humming with barely audible life. Then, without warning, it moved again, parting machinery like water flows around a stone. Its gaze found me instantly, cutting through shadows, steel, and flame with unerring accuracy. And in that instant, as my breath caught in my throat, I realized the truth. The hunter did not merely track, it understood. It had assimilated every instinct, every pattern, every attempt at evasion. It did not need to chase. The chase was over. The encounter had already occurred, written in the code of its being, and all I had done since fleeing was merely to confirm its calculations. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet that red gaze. There was no anger in it, no malice, no emotion that I could recognize. Only function, only certainty, only the completion of a pattern that had existed long before I stepped onto the sanctity of dawn and would exist long after. And as it took one deliberate step closer, the air around me seemed to thrum with inevitability, the world narrowing to the span between us. I had nowhere left to go, and still I hoped. The silence that followed was not relief. It was a vacuum, heavy and absolute, pressing against the walls and floors of the manufactorum, as though the very air feared to move. The hunter had vanished as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving only the faintest trace of heat in the metal beneath my feet and a sense of calculation lingering in the shadows. I collapsed against the scorched conduit, body trembling, lungs burning, ears ringing with the ghost of its movement. I had survived, but survival had transformed into something heavier, something less comforting than the simple act of remaining alive. Imperial forces arrived hours later, Scutarii scanning every corridor, tech priests chanting fragments of protective rites as they documented the wreckage. They found bodies in impossible positions, weapons rendered inert, and corridors that bore no signs of traditional entry or damage. The reports would call it unexplained phenomenon, a momentary aberration, something to be filed and buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. But I knew better. The hunter had not been thwarted, not once. It had moved through their weapons, through their machines, through the very logic that structured the Imperium, and left only the echo of inevitability. I was escorted from the manufactorum in silence. The officers no longer questioned me, perhaps because they finally understood that words could not contain the scope of what had occurred. I carried the fragments with me, alloy pieces that refused to be cataloged, pieces that burned with memory even after extraction. In the quiet chambers, awe of the Imperial vessel that took me to safety, I traced the red glint in my memory, felt the weight of it in the spaces between stars. Rumors spread faster than any fleet could move. Whispers on Vox channels, fragments of logs from distant hives, scribbled notes passed in secret by Mechanicus apprentices, all spoke of a figure, metallic and inexorable, moving through worlds, leaving devastation not in rage but in calculated perfection. Some called it a relic of the Dark Age. Others muttered that it might be a construct from a parallel reality, a weapon designed to hunt beyond comprehension. And I, trapped between the reality of what I had seen and the Imperium's need to sanitize the truth, became a chronicler of the impossible, the only witness able to place name and pattern upon it: Terminator. I cannot say what the future holds. Perhaps I will see it again, perhaps in another corridor, another manufactorum, another system that the Imperium believes is secure. Perhaps it will arrive to complete the pattern, or perhaps it will move on, leaving only the faint, ineffable echo of inevitability. But the weight of certainty remains. The hunter does not act out of anger, out of vengeance, out of purpose recognizable to human thought. It acts because it is designed to act, because calculation and function are woven into its very being. And I, as unwilling, unprepared, and yet irrevocably marked, am part of that design. I write this from the confines of an Imperial hold, where silence stretches longer than the corridors of a lost forge world, and where every hum of the machinery reminds me of what waits. The galaxy continues, vast and unthinking, unaware of the hunter threading through its stars. The Imperium will dismiss the tales, classify the fragments, bury the data slates, and move on as if the anomaly never existed. But I know, and I carry the truth, heavy as ceramite, as flame, as inevitability itself. Somewhere in the void, across the spans of uncountable light years, the hunter moves. And one day, whether by error, by design, or by the inexorable pull of its own calculations, it will find me again. Until then, I live with the awareness that survival is not triumph, that witness is not protection, and that in a galaxy defined by war, faith, and fire, some things cannot be fought, only endured. The red eyes have not faded from my memory. They never will.